Hello everyone, and welcome to a new video on the regulation of cardiac output. So what we're going to be doing in this video is looking at all the factors that regulate cardiac output, and mostly what we'll be doing here is mainly looking at those things that affect the stroke volume. So as we look at that, we're going to start off by looking at all the factors, kind of do a flow chart, and begin that by starting with our cardiac output equation. And this is an equation everyone should know and fully understand. That we know that cardiac output is equal to the heart rate times the stroke volume. These are two values that we need to understand about a patient. Now, cardiac output is carefully measured by using a variety of methods and means. We know the heart rate can easily be found by pulse. Stroke volumes can be measured through a variety of means, like an echocardiogram, etc. So what we want to look at here is look at heart rate and stroke volume factors and things that would be associated to those two sides of this equation. And if we start out with heart rate, this will be where we spend least amount of our time. But on the heart rate, there are three factors at least that majorly contribute to this. And we'll see that there are some overlaps here with kind of a fourth that does play a role here as well on both sides. And we'll look at that factor. But right now, I really want to focus on three factors at this moment. So let's start with two very big ones, and that is one of these will be the autonomic nervous system, and I'm going to abbreviate this the ANS. The autonomic nervous system does affect our heart rate. Here, our heart rate can be turned up or turned down by the sympathetic or parasympathetic divisions of the ANS, as well as circulating hormones that also would be present. So let's write in here hormones. And hormones circulating through the body would also come in fact, the heart rate. Think about certain things besides epinephrine, norepinephrine. Let's also think about thyroid hormones and the like. There is one that plays a role in both of these, and I want to mention it here. We'll talk about it later on in another video, called the atrial reflex, or also called the Bainbridge Reflex, which influences both the autonomic nervous system and hormones both. We do know that the ANS will get stimulated to try to move the blood out due to the increase in venous return to the atria, means that we need to clear that. This plays a role in the Frank-Starling Principle, more blood in, more blood out. And right now, this is kind of where we're going to stop when it comes to factors influencing the heart rate. So we could see those influence the heart rate. Now, if we look at those factors that influence stroke volume, remember stroke volume is calculated by taking the end diastolic volume and subtracting that from the end systolic volume. And if we take those two things from each other, we are left with the stroke volume. Now, since those two things are both independent values, they are also influenced by other factors. And there are three big factors that influence the EDV or ESV to regulate the stroke volume. And these three factors are going to be our preload, which preload is this amount of stretching that's coming in caused by venous return, more blood in, more blood out. The other third one, guys, is the contractility, or I'm going to call it inotropy, because it's a little easier to get inotropy. And the last factor that we're going to look at here is the afterload. And we will see afterload a little bit more in depth here. This is the forces that the heart has to overcome to eject blood out into the aorta. So if we were to look at this, the preload has impacts on both the EDV and the ESV. More blood in, more blood out, less blood in, less blood out, etc. So we will see that preload will influence both the EDV, which is the amount of blood the ventricle is filled with at the end of ventricular diastole, and the end systolic volume is the amount of blood left at the end of ventricular systole. And these values are definitely influenced there. Now, inotropy or heart's contractility influences the end systolic volume. That means that it's going to, if it squeezes harder, it will remove more blood. If it squeezes weaker, it will remove less blood. And we would have an effect on the ESV, the end systolic volume. And the afterload, the amount of pressure that the ventricle has to produce to overcome the pressure exerted on the semilunar valve, this definitely influences the ESV as well. And we'll look at this more in depth after we map this out. Now, to look at preload and contractility or inotropy and afterload are influenced themselves by 4 factors. And the factors we're going to start off with, one of these is going to be venous return, which is, this is the blood coming back from the veins to the atria. Now, this venous return has a huge impact on our atrial reflex, because if I bring more blood into the right atrium through the superior inferior vena cava, we have a stretching of the right atrium, which will initiate an atrial reflex that will cause the release of hormones, for example, atrial natriuretic peptide, and that will then also stimulate the ANS to speed up the heart rate to move that blood out. This also, as we said, since it speeds up our heart rate, we want to make sure that we understand that that will have an impact there. So let me make sure my arrows are all drawn out. Now, venous return also will have an effect on preload, because preload, this degree of stretching and force here that does result in the atrial reflex, is going to have to be cleared out. More blood in, right? If we increase venous return, we have an increase in preload, thereby having more blood in the heart would increase the EDV, and that would influence the stroke volume, if you're following my map. Now, another factor is filling time. And filling time guys, will help to affect the preload. Now, how is this? It will give either more or less time for blood to fill. You give it more time, an increase in preload. You give it less time, a decrease in preload, and this will influence the EDV. Now, inotropy is going to be primarily influenced by the autonomic nervous system. The ANS will come in and adjust how hard the heart contracts. It will make it contract with more force or less force, depending upon if it's sympathetic or parasympathetic. We'll see that how this works a little bit as we go here. And then another factor that we need to mention is the degree of vasodilation or vasoconstriction. So the blood vessel diameter. And the diameter of the blood vessel will have a huge impact on the afterload, making it either easier to eject blood out of that blood vessel or harder. And that will influence the afterload to change the ESV, which will influence stroke volume. So our map here is to help us understand all the major factors. So now what we want to do is factor by factor look at a few things and talk about them and make sure that we understand what's going on a little bit. And the very first factor that we want to get into, of course, is the heart rate. So let's look at heart rate. Now in heart rate, we know that heart rate is influenced primarily either through our atrial reflex, right? The atrial reflex, the ANS, or circulating hormones. And if we take a look at this atrial reflex, if more blood is arriving to the right atrium, then that will stretch the atrial wall, making the atria have to clear this. We have to get this blood through. This is the Frank-Starling Principle. Anytime that there is more blood in, we must have more blood out. This is called Frank-Starling Principle by these two guys, Mr. Frank and Mr. Starling, these two doctors, these physiologists who discovered that. So we need to make sure that we understand that. Now with the ANS, it's important that we know there are two divisions. There is the sympathetic and there is the parasympathetic division here, and these do have opposite jobs. The sympathetic division, of course, increases the heart rate, whereas the parasympathetic decreases the heart rate. So with those, your hormones can be things, guys, like epinephrine and norepinephrine, who are circulating through the bloodstream, or thyroid hormones. And these hormones can affect the heart rate, depending on their presence. And there's some other things going on there. Now, what I want to kind of do is with this heart rate is look at the ANS just a little bit more. And on the ANS, remember that in the SA node and AV nodes of the heart, there are what we call either a beta-1 receptor or a muscarinic acetylcholine receptor. There are two classes of receptors. Now, the sympathetic, right, would stimulate this beta-1, sympathetic, and this would upregulate heart rate. It would make the heartbeat faster. The muscarinics, when bound to by acetylcholine, would use the parasympathetic division to decrease the heart rate. It's very important that we know these classes of neurotransmitter receptors in terms of pharmacology as you're using beta blockers or anti-inotropic drugs on a patient. So let's take a look at some other factors here. First off, what we want to now look at is our stroke volume. And stroke volume is going to be a huge aspect of this video. Stroke volume, remember, is determined, right, by two things. We need to know the EDV, the end diastolic volume, and we take away the end systolic volume, or ESV, to calculate stroke volume. And so what we do to influence the stroke volume is we must influence these two particular values. So if we kind of imagine a teeter-totter, so to speak, here a little bit of a balancing act, and you have your stroke volume is influenced by the two things rising that, right? There is the EDV, and there is the ESV, and each one of these things influences this, right? The ESV, right, if I am going to influence ESV, I could increase the ESV, and this would always make my stroke volume go down. Or I could decrease the ESV and make my stroke volume go up. Vice versa, though, if I were to increase the EDV, my stroke volume would go in the same direction, would increase, and if I decrease the EDV, my stroke volume would go the same direction and decrease. There is this kind of tug of war going on. Remember, if end diastolic volume goes up, stroke volume also goes up. But if end systolic volume, ESV, goes up, stroke volume goes down. That EDV and stroke volume have a proportional relationship, whereas ESV and stroke volume have an inverse relationship with each other. And this is a very important relationship. So we do know that there are three major factors that influence our stroke volume. We know that there is preload, that there is inotropy, and that there is afterload. And we know that these things all influence our stroke volume. And they all would have an impact on the stroke volume. And we're going to see how this happens. So first off, what I want to do is look at what happens if these things all go up. Let's increase the preload. Let's increase the amount of blood I am filling the heart with. This will invariably increase our end diastolic volume. Now remember, if EDV goes up, our stroke volume must also go up because there is more blood in, more blood out, right? This is Frank-Starling Principle. Inotropy, also called the contractility, also it is going to decrease the ESV if it goes up in a normal, happy, healthy heart. This is assuming there's no myopathies or anything going on here, no other issues, that this person is normal and everything's going well, that they're appropriate level of cardiovascular activity, that they're not heart disease, things like that, right? So if I lower the amount of ESV, this means that there is less blood left over when the heart contracted, which means the stroke volume goes up. Now, what we notice is that preload and inotropy going up would increase the stroke volume by influencing two different things. But afterload is quite a bit of a different thing altogether. Afterload, if it goes up, this will result in an increase in the end systolic volume. This will increase the amount of blood that's left over, making it harder to do a cardiac ejection. So this will decrease the stroke volume. This is the only one here that we saw, the only factor that goes upside down, right? That goes opposite. So if we looked at these, let's take our same factors again, preload, inotropy or contractility, and afterload, and look at how these influence stroke volume when these factors are decreased. Now remember, Frank-Starling Principle says more blood in, more blood out. Well, the converse is true. Less blood in, a decrease in preload, would decrease the end diastolic volume. And anytime the EDV goes down, stroke volume would also go down proportional to it. Inotropy, the amount of contractility, means that if I fail to contract the heart hard enough, then the ESV, end systolic volume, would go up, and that means that there is more blood left over, and if ESV goes up, stroke volume must go down proportionally. But a decrease in afterload is going to have an interesting particular function here, right? If afterload is gone down, stroke volume would go up because it's easier to get blood out. This would decrease our ESV, right? Making it easier to get blood out. Because it's, and we'll look at how afterload works. So to kind of get an idea of preload, afterload, and contractility, I want to give you guys a little bit of an analogy. And on my analogy, I want you to imagine that we have a slingshot. The kind of thing you might see Dennis the Menace from the comics, Sunday morning comics, would carry. And Dennis the Menace, on his slingshot, has got his rubber bands on it, and he's got these things pulled back with a rock that he's going to fling at a can of soda over here. And so here we have his can of soda that he wants to shoot with his slingshot. And I know what you're probably thinking, what in the world is the slingshot got to do? As Dennis the Menace pulls back on the slingshot, he is pulling it back, generating our preload. This is like preload as you pull back the slingshot. Now, the rubber band on the sling here is made of a material. Some materials are more stretchy, some are less stretchy, and it depends on the material we make it out of. This is essentially my inotropy, right, or contractility. If it's a really stretchy but loose material, it won't produce a forceful shot. If it's really tense, it might be harder to pull it back, and it influences how hard this slingshot will shoot. So preload is pulling it back. Inotropy is like how stretchy the material is, but when we shoot the rock and the rock hits my can of soda, if it doesn't hit with enough force, it can't knock this over, and this is my afterload. This is what it's got to overcome to do something. If you can't knock if you cannot knock over the can, we haven't produced enough force to overcome afterload. If you produce sufficient force, you can overcome the afterload and knock the can over. So all these things play a role coming together. That preload, putting more blood in, the inotropy, how hard it contracts, and the forces afterload that it has to overcome to eject the blood. These three factors play an important and huge role, and every one of these things can be influenced by various diseases, and we influence them with drugs, and we can take a look at those. As a lot of times with patients, you want to try to get the preload off their heart so their heart doesn't have to work so hard. So a heavy can, for example, would be harder to knock over, so an increase in afterload. A lighter can would be easier to knock over, a lower afterload. And all these things play together. So let's take a look at this venous return. And remember, in venous return, what we want to look at with venous return, this will be an important thing that you will see all day early in your field is the Frank-Starling Principle. Frank-Starling Principle, Frank-Starling law tells me that if more blood in, then more blood out. And if less blood in, then less blood out. You will see that venous return, right, that my stroke volume is proportional to venous return in a normal, happy, healthy human, assuming everything else is stabilized, right? So this increase in venous return will stimulate an atrial reflex, making the heart beat harder, getting more blood in, more blood out. Remember that any time that I increase the venous return, this means that I'm increasing my preload, which also means I'm increasing stroke volume. And vice versa. A decrease in venous return means a decrease in the preload, which means a decrease in the stroke volume. all because we are influencing the end diastolic volume by my venous return. And that is always going to go in the same direction as stroke volume. Now, when it comes to filling time, I want to look at filling time with this. It's a little bit of something that we will spend a little time with. It's not the most difficult concept, but I want you to imagine that if I have a container, that I also have a faucet here that can put water into this, and I give it just 1 minute to fill with water, I get it to here after 1 minute. But if I decide to give it 1 hour, I end up filling it maybe to here, right? I give it more time to fill with water, I get more water, right? That makes sense. Filling time is going to influence my my venous return, right? It's going to put more blood in, which is going to affect my EDV. So if any time that we see this, an increase in filling time would increase the stroke volume. And why that is we've increased the EDV, right? And a decreased filling time, less time to fill up the heart with, would decrease the stroke volume because we've decreased the EDV, and these things must go the same direction. So that is a very important factor to understand there. Now, we do know that with filling time and other factors, there is the ANS, and that the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, has a big impact on inotropy besides heart rate. Now, what inotropy is how hard the heart contracts, right? This is called contractility, right? What this means is how hard the heart squeezes. Now, one thing that's very important, this is primarily caused by an increase or a decrease in calcium, Ca2 plus levels in heart tissues, as this influences muscle contractions at sarcomeres, right? So, for example, any time that I have the sympathetic division, I would increase inotropy. And then I'm also going to increase my stroke volume. But on the other hand, parasympathetic would decrease the inotropy, and normally we're going to see that it's going to decrease the stroke volume. Now, this is assuming all the other factors are staying steady, that this is the only thing changing. And it very well will be possible that in your patient, a variety of things are going on, right? Like, let's say somebody who has had a cardiac event, they've had a heart attack, and that they've had damaged heart tissues. A variety of other things will be influenced. The last factor I do want to talk about is blood vessel diameter. Now, blood vessel diameter, or the amount of vasodilation or vasoconstriction, directly influences blood pressure, right? We do know that vasoconstriction would increase my blood pressure, and vasodilation would decrease the blood pressure. And let's take a look at this and why this is important. Let's imagine I've got my aorta here, and in the aorta, this is my left ventricle, and guarding that left ventricle is the aortic semilunar valve. So let's say this is the aortic semilunar valve. Now, there is a blood pressure pushing down on that valve. And there is systole of the ventricle trying to push against that blood pressure in the aorta. Now, what afterload is I have the left ventricle has to produce sufficient systole in order to open up the heart here, this relaxation. It's got to overcome about 80 millimeters mercury of pressure in order to open that up. So if we think about this, the diameter of the blood vessel, if it becomes quite large, we know that this is influencing, right, blood pressure, and we know that this dilation would cause a decrease in blood pressure, which will make it easier to open up this valve to say we decrease the afterload, right? And then this means that my ESV must go down, so I would increase my stroke volume. Let me clean that up. And the converse would also have to be true. If this blood vessel were to constrict down and become smaller in diameter, right, because it constricted, we would increase that blood pressure, making this semilunar valve harder to open, for example, right, because of constriction, and this would increase the afterload, right, which would increase the ESV, and because ESV and stroke volume go opposite, my stroke volume would be decreased. And really, I hope this video helps you guys to really understand everything that I drew out, that I took some time to explain all of this on my initial particular chart here, on this chart. So if you're able to recreate this and then go back and understand everything I mentioned, you would have no trouble trying to understand the factors that influence all what's going on here. Now, I can do other videos on like the atrial reflex and looking at these hormones a little bit better. But with this video, definitely as much as we want to do today, I sure hope you guys appreciated it. Let me know if these videos help. Don't forget to comment, like, subscribe. Let me know what I'm doing that helps you. Give me ideas for future videos you would like to see. But as always, have a great day, and thank you so much for watching. Thank you.